The void of space loomed beyond the reinforced glass, a cosmic abyss swallowing all light except for the soft glow of Sol in the distance. Earth hung there like a fragile jewel, its blues and greens stark against the consuming blackness of the universe. Elias Kade stood in the command bay of the UN warship Resolute, watching the planet as though it might be his last time seeing it unbroken. Reports flooded in from every sector. The Xharr'kal had arrived, massive warships, each one a cathedral of death, stationed themselves beyond the orbit of Luna, their sheer presence sending ripples of fear through the United Earth Nations defense network. A single broadcast echoed across every channel, its voice thick with menace and condescension. Humanity of Sol, we are the Xharr'kal. We have conquered the weak and bowed only to the strong. Kneel, and you will be spared as servants to our empire. Resist, and your world will burn. The words hung in the air like a guillotine. Across every government chamber, every war room, a grim realization set in. No species had ever survived an encounter with the Xharr'kal. None. Kade exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers to his brow. He had seen too many wars, fought in too many battles, and buried too many friends. The Xharr'kal were not just an invading force, they were a civilization of predators. Their entire culture revolved around the domination of the lesser, the subjugation of the meek. The debate among the military brass was immediate and heated. Some called for surrender, others for a suicidal last stand. The UN's leaders knew their fleets, though formidable, could not match the Xharr'kal in sheer force. Humanity had come far, but not far enough to match an empire that had been waging war for millennia. Yet Kade understood something that the alien warlords did not. Humanity had never been the strongest, nor the fastest, nor the most advanced. But they had always been the most relentless. "We can't win a war of attrition," an admiral growled. "They have technology beyond ours, fleets that outnumber us 100 to 1. "Then we don't fight a war of attrition," Kade replied, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of steel. "We fight a war of strategy, of unpredictability, of defiance." He turned his gaze to the holographic projection of the Xharr'kal fleet, their ships bristling with weapons meant to tear apart civilizations. He knew their kind. Predators that had never tasted true challenge, conquerors that had never faced, an enemy that refused to break. The Xharr'kal expected fear. Kade would give them something else. The transmission link crackled to life as Kade stepped forward. The bridge crew exchanged glances, uncertain whether he was about to damn them all, or do something impossible. "High Warlord Vakar-Shan," Kade spoke, his voice unwavering. "You claim to be the apex predators of this galaxy. You claim to break the weak and bow to the strong. If that is true, then I challenge you." He leaned closer, his words measured, deliberate. "Single combat, you and I, a fight to submission. If I win, Earth remains free. If I lose, we kneel." A stunned silence filled the bridge. The audacity of the challenge was unthinkable, but for the Xharr'kal, honor and hierarchy were everything. To refuse would be an admission of cowardice. And if Kade knew anything about predators, it was that they never turned down a challenge they thought they could win. For a long moment, there was nothing but static. Then the guttural, growling voice of Vakar-Shan responded, "You amuse me, human. A diplomat challenging a warlord? Very well. We accept your challenge. We shall see if your species has even a fraction of the strength it claims." The transmission cut. The bridge erupted into chaos. Officers shouted, protests rang out, and warnings filled the room like an oncoming storm. Kade stood in the center of it all, a lone figure of quiet resolve. He had just gambled the fate of humanity on a single fight, and he intended to win. The silence of space was a lie. It was never truly silent, not when the air inside the Resolute vibrated with tension, not when the pulse of war drums echoed from the Xharr'kal fleet that loomed like a great beast beyond Luna's orbit. The challenge had been issued, the gauntlet thrown. Now all that remained was the reckoning. Yield! The word was a hammer against the silence. Xharr'kal hesitated, fury warring with realization. His hands trembled, his breathing ragged, and then, slowly, reluctantly, he bowed his head. The arena erupted into chaos. Warlord Vakar rose from his throne, his expression unreadable. The Xharr'kal had never lost in their own arena. Kade stood tall, blood on his blade, eyes locked onto the warlord. He had done the impossible. He had made one of the galaxy's apex predators. Bow! And now the real battle was about to begin. The silence that followed Xharr'kal's submission was deafening. It rippled through the gathered Xharr'kal warriors, their golden eyes flickering between confusion and outrage. Never before had one of their own yielded in the arena of the apex. Never before had an outsider bested them in their own domain. The warlord's champion, on his knees, had shattered the unbroken legacy of their dominance. Vakar claws tapped rhythmically against the armrest of his throne, the only sound in the suffocating tension. His gaze burned with something deeper than anger, calculation. The Xharr'kal did not know fear, but they understood power. And Elias Kade had just proven he was more than just prey. Then the warlord spoke, voice thick with something dangerously close to amusement. Impressive human, but do you think one victory earns you survival? The warlord rose, stepping forward, the heavy thud of his armored boots reverberating through the chamber. Around them, the gathered warriors bristled. They wanted blood. They wanted retribution. The smell of it hung in the air like a storm about to break. Kade wiped the blood from his blade and met the warlord's gaze without flinching. We had a deal. I won. Earth remains free. Laughter rumbled through the warriors, low, predatory. But Vakar did not laugh. Instead, he descended from his throne, walking slowly, deliberately. Did you truly believe we would risk an empire? On a single fight? The warlord's voice was almost gentle. Almost. Your species is amusing, human. You mistake cunning for strength. You mistake trickery for dominance. You want to fight. That does not make you the apex predator. Kade's fingers curled into fists. He had expected this. The Xharr'kal would never willingly abide by a challenge they lost. They would rationalize, they would twist, they would justify, and yet the warlord had not struck him down. Not yet, which meant there was still an opportunity. You claim strength is all that matters, Kade said, stepping forward. Then why hesitate? Why delay? If I am weak, end me now. If humanity is prey, crush us. But you won't, because you know what will happen if you do. A growl rippled through the gathered Xharr'kal. Kade could feel their collective indignation, the weight of their wrath pressing in. He ignored them. His gaze never left Vakar. You've conquered 100 worlds. None have survived your wrath. But tell me, warlord, how many of them fought back like we will? The warriors stirred uneasily. They had witnessed the depths of human resilience. They had seen Kade, a mere diplomat, defy their strongest warrior. And more than that, they saw something worse, the possibility that humanity was not afraid. Vakar was still, unmoving. And then, finally, he exhaled a slow breath. You speak well, human, but words are wind, and I do not make decisions based on wind. A gesture, a flick of his claws. A new challenger stepped forward. Not just any challenger. The tension snapped like a cord. Warriors roared in approval, the scent of bloodlust thick in the air. Kade felt the weight of the moment settle into his bones. The warlord had just elevated. The challenge. This was no longer about simple victory. This was a reckoning. The arena was cleared. The crowd pressed in from the shadows, watching, waiting. The warlord shed his ceremonial armor, revealing a form carved by centuries of conquest. Scars crisscrossed his obsidian fur, each a mark of a war won, a species broken. Kade rolled his shoulders, feeling the bruises from his previous fight already. tightening. He had barely survived Xharr'kal. Now he faced something far worse. The chime sounded. The duel began. Vakashan did not waste time. Vakashan's response had come swiftly, with the cold certainty of a predator that had never been bested. A transmission from the Xharr'kal flagship, the Bloodfang, displayed the warlord's image on every screen. He stood in a throne of polished bone and metal, his amber eyes gleaming with amusement. Behind him, his warriors, towering felines adorned in ceremonial battle gear, growled and snarled in approval. "Human Kade, we honor your challenge. You will fight in the arena of the apex. You will bow or you will break the arena. A spectacle reserved for only the most ruthless of the Xharr'kal, where the unworthy were ground into dust beneath the boots of their warriors." Kade's heart pounded not with fear, but with the weight of responsibility. This was not just a fight. It was a statement, a declaration that humanity would never be prey. As the Resolute moved into position, escorted by an honor guard of Xharr'kal warships, Kade felt the weight of thousands of human lives on his shoulders. The UEN military command had protested vehemently, their voices rising in a chorus of disbelief at his reckless gamble. But Kade had known something they hadn't. The Xharr'kal understood one thing above all: dominance. And to them, dominance was proven in combat. Now, as the docking clamps sealed with a hiss, he stepped into the enemy's domain. The air was thick with the scent of metal, sweat, and something primal. Xharr'kal warriors lined the chamber, their golden eyes watching as he was led forward. They didn't jeer, they didn't taunt. They observed, cold, calculating, weighing his worth. The arena of the apex was carved from the remains of a conquered world. Jagged rock formations jutted upward, a mockery of a battlefield designed to test the instincts of those who entered. The ground beneath him was scorched and cracked, the ghosts of past combatants lingering in the silence. At the far end stood Xharr'kal, the warlord's champion. A living monolith, standing at least 9 feet tall, muscles rippling beneath. Obsidian black armor. His fangs gleamed as he let out a growl of amusement. "They send a diplomat. The humans have no warriors?" Kade smirked. He had been underestimated before. It never ended well for the opposition. A deep chime resonated through the arena, signaling the beginning. The Xharr'kal warlord sat above, watching. The fight had begun. Xharr'kal moved first, as expected. A blur of muscle and ferocity, his claws arcing through the air with devastating speed. Kade ducked, sidestepping with practiced ease. The ground where he had stood shattered beneath the impact. Strength, speed, aggression. The Xharr'kal fought like apex predators, overwhelming, relentless, crushing their opponents before they could react. But predators had one fatal flaw. They always assumed they were at the top of the food chain. Kade didn't fight with brute force. He fought with experience, with adaptability. He dodged, letting Xharr'kal overextend, striking back with surgical precision. His attacks were not about power, but about placement. Joints, nerves, weak points in the armor. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Xharr'kal was fast, but Kade was patient. The Xharr'kal warrior grew frustrated, his strikes turning sloppy. That's when Kade saw his opening, a feint, a pivot, a knife drawn in a blur of motion, plunged deep into the Xharr'kal's leg. Xharr'kal let out a guttural roar, collapsing onto one knee. The crowd's growls turned to murmurs. This was not how battles were supposed to go. Humans were supposed to be crushed, not to outmaneuver. Kade didn't move in for the kill. He stepped back, knife still in hand, and met the champion's gaze. A blur of motion, a monstrous force slamming into Kade with the strength of a collapsing star. He barely had time to dodge, twisting as razor-sharp claws sliced the air where his head had been. The warlord was faster than Xharr'kal, stronger, and infinitely more experienced. Kade ducked, rolled, struck out with his blade, only for Vakashan to catch his wrist mid-motion, a vice-like grip, unyielding, crushing. Pain exploded through Kade's arm as he was flung across the arena like a ragdoll slamming into the cracked stone, his vision blurred. The world spun. A shadow loomed over him. Is this all? Vakar-Shan's voice was low, almost disappointed. Kade forced himself up, spitting blood onto the ground. No! It wasn't over, not yet. The warlord came again. Another attack. Unstoppable. Inevitable. Kade moved, barely dodging, his body screaming in protest. His mind raced. Think, adapt, survive. He couldn't beat Vakar-Shan in raw strength. He couldn't match him in speed. But there was one advantage he still had. He let the warlord close in. At the last moment, he dropped, not away, but toward him, inside his guard, a desperate gamble. His knife flashed, slicing across Vakar-Shan's left knee joint, a small weakness. But it was enough. The warlord stumbled only for a fraction of a second, but that was all Kade needed. He twisted, using the warlord's own weight against him, driving his knee into the Xharr'kal's ribs. A lesser warrior would have fallen. Vakar-Shan did not. But he did step back, and that in itself was a victory. A murmur ran through the watching warriors. Their warlord had been forced to step back. Vakar-Shan's gaze burned into Kade, unreadable. Then, slowly, he straightened. He laughed, a deep rumbling sound that sent a shudder through the chamber. "You are not prey, human." The laughter died. The warlord's gaze hardened. "But you are not the apex predator either. Not yet." The duel was over. Kade had survived. But the true battle, the battle for Earth's fate, had only just begun. The silence that followed was heavier than the gravity of the warship itself. The Xharr'kal warriors, who had gathered to witness their warlord's inevitable victory, now stood in stunned quiet. Never before had their leader been forced to step back in single combat. Never before had an opponent survived an encounter with Vakar-Shan. Yet there stood Elias Kade, battered, bloodied, but unbowed. The warlord exhaled slowly, his golden eyes narrowing in contemplation. The crowd still hung on the precipice of action, uncertain whether they should rush forward to strike down the human or stand in awe of what had just transpired. But Vakar-Shan held up a single clawed hand, and they froze. "You are more than I expected," he said at last. "More than any of us." "Expected?" Kade didn't speak. Every inch of his body screamed in protest, his breath ragged, his limbs heavy with exhaustion. He knew the fight had taken more out of him than he let show. If Vakar-Shan chose to continue, Kade wouldn't last. But he also knew something far more important. This wasn't just about combat anymore. This was about proving a point. Humanity had made its stand, and Vakar-Shan had acknowledged it. But the warlord wasn't done. "You have fought well, human," he continued, stepping forward. "But strength alone does not win wars. Dominance is not just about battle. It is about knowing when to end it." Kade tensed, instinct screaming at him to prepare for another attack. But then Vakar-Shan did something no Xharr'kal had ever done before. A single knee touched the scorched ground of the arena, his gaze locked onto Kade's, not in submission, but in recognition. A murmur rippled through the crowd, disbelief giving way to something far deeper, respect. A warlord did not kneel to an enemy, not unless the enemy had proven themselves worthy. Kade swallowed, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He had gambled everything on this moment, and now he stood on the edge of a knife. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and this fragile understanding would shatter. "I did not come here to conquer," Kade said, his voice hoarse but unwavering. "I came here to stop you from making the greatest mistake of your empire's history." Vakar-Shan's gaze sharpened. "And what mistake would that be?" Kade took a slow breath, gathering his strength. "You believe war is the only measure of strength, that the strong rule because they must. But strength is more than destruction. It is knowing when to fight and when to build. You've crushed 100 species, taken their worlds, turned them into shadows of what they once were. But what happens when you face an enemy that won't be crushed? One that adapts, one that learns, one that never, ever kneels. The Xharr'kal warriors bristled at the words, but Vakar-Shan only tilted his head slightly, considering. You think. Humans are that enemy. Kade met his gaze without hesitation. I know we are. A moment stretched between them, thick with something unspoken. The warlord's claws flexed against the stone, his mind turning over the possibilities, the consequences. Kade knew what he was thinking. The Xharr'kal could destroy Earth. They had the firepower, they had the numbers, but would they survive? The war that followed. Humanity would not go quietly. Even if Earth burned, the survivors would scatter. They would fight from the shadows, from the void, from every world that dared to shelter them. And they would never stop. The Xharr'kal had never encountered a species like them before, and Vakar-Shan knew it. A slow, deliberate breath. Then we must decide, the warlord murmured, if it is better to make you our enemies. His golden gaze met Kade's, or our allies. The arena held its breath. Kade forced his battered body to stand tall. You already know the answer to that. Vakar-Shan let out a long, rumbling exhale, something between a sigh and a growl. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he rose to his full height once more, and he extended a hand. Not in conquest, not in dominance, but in acknowledgement. A choice had been made, and the future of two species would never be the same again. The silence stretched, heavier than the weight of the battle just fought. Every Xharr'kal warrior present, seasoned killers, conquerors of worlds, watched as their warlord extended his hand to the human. It was not an act of submission, it was recognition. Elias Kade, bruised, battered, and barely standing, looked at the outstretched, clawed hand. He knew what this meant, not just for himself, but for Earth, for humanity as a whole. 1,000 possibilities flashed through his mind, each one leading to a different future. But in that moment, there was only one path forward. He clasped Vakar-Shan's hand. The Xharr'kal warriors erupted in an uproar, not of anger, but of shock. Their warlord had chosen to stand with a human, something that had never been done in their history. Some snarled, their predatory instincts rebelling against the mere thought of treating prey as equals. Others stood frozen, waiting for their leader's next command. Vakar-Shan turned to his people, his voice echoing through the chamber. The humans have earned our respect. They are not weak, they are not prey. To fight them would be to invite ruin. To fight with them, that would forge something greater. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some warriors bared their fangs in displeasure, but none openly defied him. The Xharr'kal were a species built upon hierarchy and dominance, and their leader had made his decision. Kade exhaled, feeling the tremors of pain in his body. He had done the impossible, not just survived but changed the course of history. Yet he knew this was only the beginning. The war had not been avoided, only postponed. Back aboard the Resolute, the atmosphere was electric. The news had spread. Through the UEN fleet like wildfire, Kade had fought the Xharr'kal warlord and lived. More than that, he had forced an empire built on conquest to reconsider its path. The transmission between Earth's leaders and the Xharr'kal High Command was filled with tension. Diplomats scrambled to understand the implications. Generals debated if this was a ploy, a feint before an inevitable war. But Kade knew the truth. This was real. The Xharr'kal were not turning their backs on war. It was in their blood, but they had seen something in humanity that they had never encountered before. A species that would never break, never kneel, never stop fighting. And that had changed everything. Days later, the first official human-Xharr'kal negotiations took place aboard a neutral station, a place where conquerors and survivors met as equals. The terms were debated, tensions flared, but the core agreement remained clear. The Xharr'kal would not conquer Earth. They would not destroy humanity. In return, humanity would not challenge their empire, yet. But something deeper had begun. A shift in the galactic order. A mutual understanding between two species that had once been destined for war. As he stood on the bridge of the Resolute, watching the Xharr'kal fleet reposition itself, not as invaders but as potential allies, Kade allowed himself a rare moment of introspection. "We are not the apex predators of this galaxy," he murmured to himself. "Not yet, because war was not over. The Xharr'kal still believed in strength, in dominance. But now they understood that strength came in many forms, and for the first time in their history, they had chosen respect over annihilation. Kade knew this wasn't a victory in the traditional sense, but it was something far more valuable. It was the beginning of something greater. The void of space stretched infinitely beyond the viewport, stars glimmering like distant memories. Xharr'kal fleet, once poised to reduce Earth to ashes, now moved in formation, withdrawing beyond the Sol system's outer rim, not as defeated invaders, but as something new, something uncertain. Elias Kade stood in the dim glow of the Resolute's command deck, his gaze locked onto the retreating warships. The weight of what had transpired pressed against his weary frame, but his mind was sharper than ever. This was not an end, this was a beginning. A soft chime signaled an incoming encrypted transmission. Kade tapped the control panel, and the warlord's imposing figure appeared in holographic form. Vakarshan's golden eyes studied him with that same unreadable intensity. "You have changed the course of our empire, human." His voice was neither praise nor condemnation, just fact. "But know this, we are not finished. This was not a surrender, it was an observation." Kade smirked, though exhaustion clung to his bones. "I never expected otherwise." The warlord's expression remained still for a moment before a deep, rumbling chuckle resonated through the transmission. "Good. Then be ready. Because the next time we meet, it will not be with words. It will be to test if your kind has truly earned its place in the void." The transmission cut out. The display flickered, then went dark. Kade exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. A test. That's what this was. The Xharr'kal weren't abandoning their warrior nature. They were adapting. They saw humanity not as prey, but as rivals. The war wasn't over. It had merely evolved, and Kade knew that Earth needed to evolve too. Turning, he walked toward the strategy chamber where the UEN leadership awaited his report. His body ached from the battles fought, but his mind was already moving toward the future. Because war was inevitable, but this time it wouldn't be fought with desperation. This time humanity would be ready. And when the Xharr'kal returned, they would find that humanity had become something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Something that even apex predators would have to fear.